going to try to keep this down to 15 or 20 minutes. There's a lot of material here, but a lot of it I'm just going to kind of flip through. That it's going to be made available on the site afterwards, where you can look at it and look at some of the references in the data. So this is well. First of all, let me make an advert here for doing a presentation. I'm doing a book report on the God the Failed Hypothesis by Victor Stenger. This is about as easy a presentation as you can do, a book report. You read a book, you throw up a few slides about what it's about, and you inform people and whet their interest in going and reading this book. And they go, oh wow, this looks like it's got some interesting material in it. I want to go read this book myself. If you have a book you've read, if you've had a video you've watched, if you have a course, the great courses, I know I've got courses on there that you've participated in, and you want to socialize that with the group, you can throw together a 10, 15, 20-minute presentation and socialize that and educate everybody, and that would be awesome. So I just throwing out a little plug for doing a book report. Haven't done a book report since I was 12, but I'm going to do another one. So next slide.
Well, let's do this like the old recordings, storybook recordings when on little records. When you want me to turn the page, you have to ding or something.
Not easy. There will be no dinging in this room.
We need somebody else to run the projector up here. So first I wanted to start off with a little background on Victor Stenger. Victor has over a 40-year career in elementary particle physics and astrophysics. This guy has done a lot, and he's a very scientific mind. He participated in some of the early particle physics research that developed what we now know as the standard model of physics. PhD in physics, MS in physics, UCLA. He's also a fellow of the, let me see if I get this right, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. Is that correct? Yes. SciCop? And research fellow for the Center for Inquiry. So the important thing is that this guy comes from a very scientific background, and he approaches this book, God the Failed Hypothesis, from a very scientific approach. It's approachable though. I mean, it's something the layperson can read and still understand it, but those who are technically oriented can appreciate the methodology he employs here. Dude, I'm telling you, this is not going to work. So what is the hypothesis? So the God hypothesis is that there's the supernatural hypothesis of God is testable, verifiable, and falsifiable with the established methods of science. Now, his approach is to take the existence of God as a scientific hypothesis, and the consequences of that hypothesis are searched for in the objective observations of the world around us. Models will be assumed in which God has specific attributes. So he's building a model of God that has specific attributes that he's going to test against the observations in the world. If we have no evidence, and I've kind of highlighted the word evidence here because we're going to talk about what that means. What do we mean by evidence? If there's no evidence or other reason for believing, then we can be pretty sure that God does not exist. So that's his hypothesis, that's his approach. Next. So what does he mean by scientific evidence? Well, when he talks about scientific evidence, he's talking about studies and analyses that follow a rigorous scientific methodology. That is, the study protocols include evaluation of sources of error. The hypotheses are clearly established before the data taking. The reason this is important because a lot of studies do what's called data mining, which means that they go through and they develop their data and they reduce their data. And as they begin to look through their data, they begin to see trends in their data, and they formulate the hypothesis based on the trends in the data, rather than formulating the hypothesis beforehand and seeing if the data bear them out. Controls for bias. This is why blinding is important. Double-blinded studies, but double-blinded tests. So neither the subject nor the researcher know where the controls are. The hypothesis must be falsifiable. We've all heard this 1,000 times. If your hypothesis isn't falsifiable, then it doesn't bear any scientific merit. And the results must be independently replicated. Now these are important because these are the standard of evidence that he's applying. And he says here, this is kind of an aside down at the bottom, he talks about the asymmetry of the scientific method. He says failure to pass a required test is sufficient to falsify a model, but just because you pass a test doesn't verify the model. He says that because we're not sure that if a better model doesn't come along down the line. Just because your model passes a test doesn't mean that that model sufficiently represents what you're trying to evaluate. If I'm getting too deep in it, just raise your hand and just say, "Dude, move on," and I'll move on. Already?
Yeah, well, just to let you know, model, I prayed that I would get here alive, and I did.
Is that right? You think that satisfies the evidence?
Are you sure you're alive?
Okay, so
Good question.
moving forward.
But what did you
Moving forward.
Sure, yeah.
Moving forward, thank you. Victor spends the first chapter talking about models because a lot of people, particularly those who are not scientifically educated, don't really understand what's meant in the scientific world by model. And what he means is, well, we talked about what a model is, but he wants to bear out the elements of the model, saying that they do not necessarily need to correspond to the elements of reality. A model doesn't have to be an exact representation of reality in order to be useful. All it has to do is be able to fit the data, fit the observations, and be a good predictor of observations. The elements are not limited to those supported by direct observation. Being a physicist, he uses the Standard Model many times throughout this book. And in this section right here, he talks about quarks. Nobody's ever observed a quark, okay? You just can't, it doesn't. But the mathematical formulations in the models that develop the Standard Model predict the existence of quarks. And the observations, when that models are applied, fit the data. So even though you can't physically observe a quark, you can be confident the existence of quark is somehow related to reality because the model fits the observation. So I don't know if that makes sense to everybody, but the scientific models are human inventions and don't necessarily represent, or they represent the best we can do at describing reality. And when a model successfully describes a wide range of observations, we can be relatively confident that the elements of those models have something to do with reality. And they don't necessarily represent absolute reality, but they have something to do with reality. So the theologian might say something on the order of, well, how can we mere mortals know about the true nature of God who lies beyond our sensibilities? Well, the answer is that we don't need to know. We have a model. And if that model, whether those objects are real or not, doesn't change the fact that that model has utility in evaluating the attributes of that God. By dealing with God in terms of a model, then we get rid of the objections that the true God lies beyond our cognitive capabilities. And if it's demonstrated that that God with those particular attributes is rejected by the data, then we can say that that God does not exist. But we're not saying that all conceivable gods don't exist. George Box is an awesome guy. He's a British mathematician and statistician. He actually died earlier this year. The reason I threw him up here is because he has one of my favorite quotes of all time, which is, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. That's an indication, that's his acknowledgement that no model absolutely represents reality, but many models are useful in describing reality. So doesn't he just look like a Norman Rockwell grandfather up there? He does to me anyway. So next. So what is the God model? What is the model? What are the attributes that he's going to be testing? This is based on the Judeo-Christian Islamic God. There are 8 attributes that he's testing. One, that God is the creator and preserver of the universe, that God is the architect of the universe and authored the laws of the universe, that God can step in and change events as he sees fit, largely due to entreaties from humans. God is the creator and preserver of life, where human beings hold a special place in the universe. He's endowed humans with an immaterial, eternal soul. That God is the source of all morality and value. That he's revealed truths in scriptures, and that he doesn't deliberately hide himself from human beings. So Okay, so that's the model. These are the attributes that he's going to be testing throughout his book. Yeah, go ahead. That he's going to be testing throughout his book. Now, these are the actual chapter titles of the remainder of the book. The Illusion of Design, The Searching for a World Beyond Matter, Cosmic Evidence. You can see, based on these titles, that he's testing each of these attributes one by one, and he's searching the data to see what in the observable world we can say that brings information about these attributes of God. So I've highlighted in gold. I can't talk about all of these because we'd be up here all day, and we'd be up here for the 4.5 hours. But I'm going to talk about just a couple of things from the ones highlighted in gold here. So in Searching for a World Beyond Matter, next. These are the chapter. These are the subtitles in this chapter, and I have to look here to see what all these are different about. So mind and soul, this is the notion that we have physical bodies, that we are more than just our physical bodies. Brain science today, this is the idea of what current scientific advances in psychology and neurology talk about. ESP, how our disembodied soul affects the physical world around us through telekinesis or whatever, predicting the future. Does prayer work? He highlights different studies that show that prayer does work and that prayer doesn't work, and talks about why each of them may or may not be right. Immortality, the soul, existing beyond the death of the body. So I'm going to just talk about one of these items real quick. Does prayer work? So the next chart, he shows 3 studies here, authored by Flam, which you should have known immediately was not a legitimate study. Authored in the Scientific Review of Alternative Medicine. We have one in the Southern Medical Journal and one in the Archives of Internal Medicine. Now, for different reasons, he shows why these studies are not legitimate scientific studies, because either they didn't control correctly or they were doing, in fact, one of these was blatantly data mining. I don't remember which one it was. It was using other studies and picking out the positives from those studies and ignoring the negatives. So this is an example of the evidence he gives against prayer actually working. And these are some studies that he shows that show no observable effect from these studies in prayer. This is in the Journal of Reproductive Medicine, 2 from the British Medical Journal, 1 from Lancet, and 1 from the American Heart Journal. And he shows why these studies have more scientific credit, because they used very good controls. They used a statistically significant number of participants. They used prayer groups, not just from a Christian group or a Catholic group, but from Muslim groups and from Buddhist groups and from all over the world. And they used clinics, combined efforts from the Mayo Clinic and what's the one at Johns Hopkins? Well, I don't remember what the one at Johns Hopkins is, but and there's one at Harvard, I think. So he shows why the fact that these studies show no observable effect have more scientific credibility than the other ones. So in the next chapter I'm going to look at, it says, where do our values come from? Do they come from God? So he talks about this pipeline from God. This is, I have to check my notes here. This is religions insisting that they have a pipeline to God from which they can discern right and wrong directly from the mind of God. Common standards, these are the existence of universal moral code that regardless of anyone's belief. Noble ideas, these are principles that actually predate the Bible but are claimed by the Bible. The good society, this is the idea that we're a Christian nation and that our legal system is based on the 10 Commandments. Nobody's ever heard that before. Holy horrors, I can only let you imagine what that's about. And natural morality, this is the natural evolutionary origins of morality. So I'm going to talk real quick about noble ideas. He says that however common may be the view that religion is a source of moral behavior, what do the data say? So not everybody agrees on every issue. Even people within a set religious or group doctrine and dogma don't all agree always on what's right and what's wrong. They may look to the Bible, but they have to interpret what that means to them. And so what they use to evaluate that must come from somewhere else. So the fact that these principles were developed earlier in history is an indication that these tenets were adopted by rather than generated in or learned from religion. So it's fine that they preach these precepts, but they have no claim to say that they were developed by their deity. And let's talk about a couple of them. One of them is the Sermon on the Mount. Everybody, well, I can't say everybody, I guess, but my background, I'm very familiar with the love your enemies, do not resist the one who tempts you. This tenet is also shown in Taoism, in the Tao Te Ching 49. I treat those who are good with goodness. I also treat those who are good with who are not good with goodness. In Buddhism, conquer anger with love, conquer evil by good. Out of Hinduism, we have the superior being does not render evil for evil. So these are tenets that come from other places besides this Judeo-Christian Islamic God hypothesis. The next one is the Golden Rule, do unto others. Is this uniquely Christian or is this uniquely Judeo-Christian Islamic? Well, no. In Hinduism, we have the sum of all true righteousness. Deal with others as thou with thyself be dealt by. This is 150 years BCE. Isocrates, do unto others that do not do to others what would anger you if done to you by others. That's 357 BC. And Confucius, what you do not want others to do to you, do not do to others. This is 500 BC. So there's actually no original moral concept of any significance that can be found in the New Testament. And this is data that he uses to refute the idea that God is, or one of them, that God is the source of our moral values, or at least the Judeo-Christian Islamic God. The next, possible and impossible gods. These are gods that disagree with the data. And I'm going to go through, the one that he identifies with these attributes is are all of the gods that disagree with the data. In what if, he says, well, let's take a different angle. What would we need to do? What observations would we need to make in order to shore up this hypothesis, in order to make this hypothesis correct? What would need to happen? What would we need to observe from the universe? So what gods remain? Well, the gods, again, he said, he had specific attributes for God up there, and those are the ones he falsified. So if there are gods out there that don't have those attributes, those gods still remain. He hasn't falsified those using the data yet. And then the hiddenness problem. This is the idea that the lack of evidence speaks to God's hiddenness from all but a select elite, and why that's a problem. So I'm not going to read through all these, but I'm just going to show, for instance, he says up here that the God who's responsible for the complex structure of the world fails to agree with the empirical data. He says, this shows none of the expected signs of design, and indeed the universe looks as it should in absence of design. This is kind of a summary statement. He's already gone through the data and shown why this is not true, so he puts a little summary statement up here. He's got that for immortal souls, for God interacting with humans. Next. He's got it for miraculous and supernaturally created the universe. The fine-tuned laws, God who communicates directly with humans by means of revelation fails. The God who's the source of all morality fails. This is not relative morality. Believers and non-believers alike agree on a common set of values. And lastly, he uses this existence of evil. The gratuitous suffering is logically inconsistent. So in the next chart, this is the last chapter. And he says, well, living in a godless universe, how do we deal with that? He says, is religion useful? He goes through and talks about the claims that are made for why religion is a useful thing, why it's a good thing, and he talks about why those don't make sense. He talks about the negative impact of religion on society. He gives several examples of that. He talks about meaning. He says it's not necessary to have religion to have meaning in your life. And he talks about the idea that religion provides comfort and inspiration, and why that's not necessarily the case. And then he ends up with this quote, which I like as well. It's the first time I've seen this quote. It says, a man who says if God is dead, nothing matters, is a spoiled child who's never looked at his fellow man with compassion. This is from Kai Nielsen. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. But I thought it was a good quote. So in summary, I'll just say this was a well-written book. I enjoyed reading it. I really appreciated the methodical and scientific approach that he took to investigating this God hypothesis. There's some really good research in here, and there's some really excellent references. I mean, each chapter is just full of pages and pages of references. You have the book there.
Anybody wants to look at it? Mike?
So that's all I have. These are his bibliography. These are some additional books that he's done, and that's all I have. So. Any questions? Oh, geez.
I do have a question.
Carl, imagine that.
Sorry. Religion is always pumped up on Sunday. All the parking lots are full of the churches around my house on Saturday. And, but the
Thanks.
people who have another point of view, they don't seem to be out there like this group here.
Well, let's go pick it up.
Yeah, it's kind of like, we're in here, a little select group of 20. And then the parking lot at near the church on the hill right there in San Jose, there's like a couple thousand cars. And I'm kind of wondering, is this group or groups like us having a little trouble with the getting the popular vote here?
Well, I think the issue is that we've been around since April 1st and they've been around for 2,000 years, so that's what I'm saying.
But atheists have been around for a while.
Oh, atheists have been around much longer than that, yeah. That's a good question.
We're just starting. I think we're just starting to be. We're starting to be organized.
It's easy to rally someone around a doctrine. It's harder to rally someone around an absence of a doctrine, so maybe that's the key.
Carl, I think part of it is there's a lot of baggage and negative connotations associated with being an atheist, and especially just the term atheist. That's why a lot of people prefer to use the term skeptic or humanist. And so I think there's a lot of people who are in the closet about their atheism, and they're afraid to come out because it's not going to put them in a favorable spotlight.
So we need a guy who write a publicist to put us positive image. You know, somehow this image is
Well, that's our
negative.
mission statement.
I'm
right?
working on it.
There you go.
Yeah,
Have
we
you ever
got
heard
that.
the thing
So-
they say there's no atheists in foxholes? Well, there are a lot confused.
Warner, did you have a question?
You gotta get them out, help them out.
Wait, Warner's got a question. Go ahead, Warner.
This discussion has diverted my question to maybe point out something different, and that is that, maybe it's related to my question, which is, you sort of dismissed out of hand that religion is not useful for anything. And that seems a bit extreme to me.
I didn't dismiss out of hand.
Well,
Victor did.
Maybe we should discuss that.
But it wasn't out of hand. If you read the book, he gives examples and rationale for why he says that.
That's the 4-hour version.
But that's the 4-hour version.
If you read Greg Epstein's
Didn't we
stuff
pay for
on
4 hours?
humanism, he points out that there are a lot of valuable things in religion of bringing people together in a community, just the way we are right here. And so there's a lot of baggage there. People have been taught this for thousands of years, and their parents, so they're following their parents, and that's why there's so many more of them out there. And those things don't change really quickly. But we need to create sort of alternative holidays and traditions and these kind of things that we can sort of gather around.
That's happening too, though.
Well,
I mean, you look
sure.
at the meetup
That's
groups,
what's needed.
they're growing and
If I might
growing.
ask.
And I think people are finally realizing you don't have to have God or church to have that social community.
There you go.
Communities are popping up all over the place.
So
So I think it is
if we had
changing.
some kind of a national winter solstice celebration or.
We do. International Chocolate Haire is next week.
Why do you need that?
What's next week?
International
Just
Chocolate
because
Haire.
it brings the community together, it brings.
But you
Yeah,
can get together
Yeah,
without,
columns, getting those.
Aaron, did you raise your hand?
or whatever,
Tim
designated
did.
days. It's-
When you get a quorum, you get certain,
You're trying to mimic what they're doing.
I'm trying to get around the room here.
yeah, well, yes, in a certain way, because having this kind of national thing that is, it brings a bigger aura to it than just a bunch of small groups getting together doing random different things at all different times. I mean, I'd rather be out running right now. Something like that. But it's more, it's useful to be here
Tim, did you want to say something?
with the group, and if you have, I mean, think of all the aura
All I'm
around
saying is that
Christmas.
Are you taking over, man?
Not required.
I'm just wanted to.
Religion wasn't around, I'd rather go out running with you. There's other better things to do than to wallow in this, the thing about supernatural superstition that is harmful to people. That's one of the reasons why I'm here. I'd rather not be here, rather it not be an issue.
I would agree with that in saying that, yeah, the fact that we have to organize and actually be a voice of reason in our country is frustrating. Yeah, it is. But it's really important that we are together too, because, I mean, I think for many of us who probably came from a religious background, that community. I mean, I was by myself, and I was outcast, you know, that whole thing. It's like, now what do I do? I'm missing out on all that stuff that I did with my community. So I think this is a really, really important part. Not just to, because I'd rather be doing other things. I mean, I think it's really important for us to be someplace that someone could land and say, well, I don't believe in this stuff anymore, so I've got this other group of people who understand that and willing to, you know, back me up. That's what yeah. Go ahead, Jack.
I have a question. So, that kind of negative stigma around the word atheist, it's because you're saying you're an atheist instead of agnostic, right? The agnostics get off a little easier, and the atheists say, oh, they're just, wimpy atheists, right? What I would say is that atheism, I guess, should rally around some like common natural science stuff like solstices and things like that. And I think it's a good idea to have larger celebrations and to have little groups like that. But I also wanted to ask, how many of you in this room would say that you have a spiritual aspect to your life? That's not religious, spiritual, because that's where they get the thing. It's all, you guys are just materialists. You might as well just be robots. Here's the lumbering robot argument.
You love your family.
Can you define spiritual?
Yeah, it's a tough
It means beyond materialism. It means you take the standard model and say there's something beyond that.
What's a Unitarian view?
Give an example of something that's beyond materialism.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, okay, well, everything comes from materialism. But you believe that materialism is imbued with something beyond the four forces which we currently understand, which are linked, three of them linked, and one of them mysterious.
Something that we can't demonstrate, is what you're saying.
No, well, it really depends on your interpretation of the word God. I mean, definitely not the Judeo-Christian Islam God.
When you're talking about things you can't describe.
Well, not judgment.
Well, no, I can describe it
There's no
just more
spirituality.
complex and in-depth than I would like to go to with, unless all of you have degrees
Do you
in
believe in the
quantum
word
physics.
Based
I'd
on,
have to stop here.
based
Okay.
on the information in this book, he's a physicist, and also from Scot Haire, which I've been seeing, watching a lot of his videos, they specifically say that if there were anything that were acting on this world, we would have noticed it. There may be some things that could be powerful, but only at a very, very short distance, at hundredth, a millionth of a distance of length of an atom. Or they could be acting at long range, but are very, 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 very weak, 100,000 times weaker than gravity. And I'm more powerful than gravity. So we know.
Well, this gravity. All right.
Okay, so what, reading this book and watching those videos and reading other things tells us that if there were any means, any force by which any of those things could act, like a God or a spiritual effect on the universe, that would have been
It would be
measured, it would have been detected, and it has not, and it does not exist.
I do argue it because I brought that word love. And I think everybody loves somebody, and it does feel like a force.
Yeah.
And so there is something kind of weird about
Well,
that.
there's
Unless
nothing,
you're a sociopath.
yeah, there's nothing.
I can kill everyone.
You got too
God
much.
doesn't care.
Hang on.
I'll admit there are emergent properties, yeah, that, like water molecules by themselves are not wet, but when you have lots of water molecules together, you have wetness. In the same way, human beings with the kind of brain we have, we get consciousness and love and other kinds of things, but they're not beyond us, they are just what we do. The mind is what the brain does.
So, you guys.
Well, the spiritual question. The person could say, well, I'm not religious or I don't believe in God, but I feel like I'm spiritual.
Right.
I'm working my way through an audiobook right now by Richard Carrier. Has anyone heard of him before?
Oh, yeah.
It's called Sensitive Goodness Without God, Defense of Metaphysical Naturalism. And he goes into very eloquent detail about, he uses the word spiritual, and he owns it. And what he says, spiritual is to have something that's more important, that it goes beyond your individual self-importance, something that's higher than you, or that's more important than your individual concerns.
Yeah.
And that's what a spiritual person is. according to him.
Is that supernatural?
But he agrees that, you know, there is problems within society, that people are selfish and materialistic and they get into these negative, if you go down a negative path that way, and he says the lack is not religion per se, but it's a lack of personal philosophy. And he thinks that philosophy is something that should be taught in schools as well, and, you know, codes of ethics and things like that, that could supplant religion. And you could still have that sense of something greater than yourself that gives your life meaning through that.
Yeah.
The welfare of humanity, you know, the
Yeah.
benefit of society, things like that.
Yeah, and Sam Harris talks too about spirituality, but in a different sense. So you're talking about the definition of terms at some point, right? And I think Hitchens said, what was it? He wants to explain that there is a difference between transcendence and the supernatural, right? That you can have love and music and things like that you feel elated about, but it's not necessarily something that's coming from an external source, something supernatural that you're manifesting inside your life.
And they all have different definitions.
Right.
Love can be defined in many different ways by different people, so can music. I mean, what's music to somebody's ears may not be love.
Yeah.